Those are both wonderful questions. So let's see. The issue of the connection between colonial policy and the marginalization of the study of Punjabi in the academy, I do think that there's a correlation between those two, right? Colonial language policy contributed to the production of grammars. It contributed to the production of literary histories. It contributed to the production of literature, right? One of the sort of seminal essays for me about thinking about language policy and its impact on a tradition is actually our wonderful scholar of Urdu, C.M. Naeem. Many years ago, published a wonderful essay called Prize-Winning Adab, in which he talks about a competition that was initiated by the colonial state to produce a morals literature for women that could be used in schools, and how he connects this to the actual production of the early Urdu novel, and in fact, Deputy Nazir Ahmed's novels, right? Talking about how he wrote those novels in a sense at the impetus of the colonial state, participated in this competition, was rewarded for this participation. So if you think about the question of patronage, the colonial state became a sort of patron for certain languages, partly because those languages, once they were adopted as official languages, they required an apparatus. They required texts. They required books for schools. They were required for being hired in the administration subsequently. So we can see that colonial policy, I would argue, gave a fillip to some languages. And the absence of that patronage, withdrawing that patronage, does have real world consequences. Now, I've argued in my book that those consequences may not be affective, right? And that is that the colonial policy did not have an influence on people's love for their languages. It did not have an impact on people's embrace of their literatures, largely oral in the case of Punjabi. It did not, that there is a very powerful, in fact, affective relationship that Punjabi speakers feel with their language and their literature. So the colonial state was not able to interfere in that particular and quite organic connection, but the apparatus and the patronage that's provided by being an official language, without that, right, the study of Punjabi was marginalized. And I think we do see the effects of that, both in terms of people's attitudes towards the Punjabi language. Indeed, Punjabi speakers, there's been very good work on this too, that Punjabi speakers not always embracing the language in official arenas, right? In education, perhaps. But when it comes to the affective dimension of Punjabi, it is both very strong and it is global in scope, right? That Punjabi speakers everywhere share that tie. So, although empirically, I don't think I can draw that connection for you, I think that conceptually and intellectually, we can see how patronage for a language does produce space in the academy. Just the way, even today, patronage through things like endowed chairs produces a space for the study of particular traditions. So I don't think that in terms of the architecture of our education system, I don't think things are that different. And patronage continues to be an important aspect of what gets studied, what is valorized, what has status. So I think we can trace the impact of colonial language policy. I've tried to trace some of that in my book in terms of how it is pushed out of particular arenas, right? It's not a language of administration in the Punjab during the colonial period. It's not, there's a tussle about it even being a language of education at Punjab University. It doesn't have the same status as the study of Urdu does. Nor does it have the same status as Urdu in Punjabi society, because Urdu is the language of administration, Urdu is the language of education. So if we come to the post-colonial period to think about that, I think that the way I would think about that influence is Urdu is the national language of Pakistan, right? Hindi is the national language of India. Punjabi is an official language in Punjab state in India, but there is a sense that to get ahead, to excel, to advance, to gain economic advantage, that you need to operate in a language which has more prestige, right? So in the Indian case, Punjabi becomes both the language of the home, the language of, again, affective relationships. It's also a language of liturgy in the case of the Sikh community. So it has particular ties there. But in terms of thinking about the public sphere, in terms of thinking about, economic advancement, class mobility, Hindi has more purchase. And I think that much the same has happened in Pakistan, where, there's more purchase in terms of class mobility for Urdu. So if you have people who are in marginal communities socioeconomically, when they think of educating their children, they want them, in fact, they want to jump over Urdu. They want English language education for their children because English is the status language, right? But certainly even Urdu language education would be one leg up, right, for their children, for the next generation. Punjabi, I guess we could say Punjabi, the Navinyanda, Punjabi's name isn't even there, right? It's just not thought about in those arenas. And the only way we can understand why it isn't thought about in those arenas is because there's a legacy, right? The kind of aficionados of Punjabi in Pakistan will often complain that Punjab is the only region where Punjabi is not a language of education. It's not an official language, right? They say Sindh has Sindhi, Baluchistan, right, it has its language. NWFP, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, they have Pashto, right? So this kind of marginalization from state arenas is something entirely, I think, attributable to colonial policy. And then that has real world effects in terms of status economies. Okay. Why is it more important for, or valorized more by people in diaspora? I would say that as a member of that diaspora, as somebody who was born outside the subcontinent and has lived my whole life outside the subcontinent, the cultural resonance, that affective tie, often is amplified when you are away from your home culture. And so my parents indeed were born outside South Asia. Punjabi is their first language because that's the language that they spoke with their parents. That's the language that those siblings speak with each other. That's the language that was the language of home. And yet even they embraced status economies and taught my generation Urdu because they thought that would have more value. So this question of value, how do we decide what value to accord languages? This, I think, has a direct relationship to state policy. So it may not have, it may not impact the affective attachments people have, but I think it does affect this idea of value in the public sphere in society. Thank you for that question. So I am a strong proponent of thinking that popular literature provides insights to our understanding of a society in which that literature circulated, right? And by popular, I mean a literature that was for which there was a market, right? So when I began my research and I began looking at Punjabi print culture, I was struck by the prevalence of the qisse tradition in Punjabi publishing of the late 19th and early 20th century, of the late-colonial period. And this led me to ask why this story would have such resonance, right? So in a way, it's a set of kind of conceptual moves to think that a story that is told and retold and forged in a sense both anew but with continuity in every retelling, that it becomes a site where by gauging changes or by seeing what is emphasized, by actually bringing a literary critical analysis to the texts that circulated, as a historian, it can provide insights about society. When I began to apply this approach to Punjabi printed qisse of Hir Ranjha from the late 19th and early 20th century, my method was really twofold. One was to provide a literary historical context so that we could understand what this tradition was, what were in a sense, is there an Ur text? What transformations had this tradition gone through prior to its advent in print? And there I learned that this was a tradition of storytelling that went back centuries, that there was what we would today, I think, in the Western Academy call a high tradition. We might point to Varis Shah's Hir as that kind of a text. I saw that it circulated through different literary forms. So you have Varis Shah doing an epic poem, you have the poetry of Sufi saints, and this allowed me to think about not only the kinds of literary production, but also the spaces where that literature would have circulated. Importantly, in the case of Punjabi and in the case of these texts that I've just mentioned, they circulated through, in the case of Varis Shah, through manuscripts, but they also circulated orally, right? This was a poetry that was sung and circulated among illiterate people also. So on one kind of axis, I tried to provide a longue durée history of the narrative tradition so we could think about who produced it, when they produced it, what were the literary forms, how did the story change, and that gives you kind of one axis of analysis. The second axis was to look at late 19th century and early 20th century printed texts that were popular, that circulated in a market, that were published by commercial presses. And when I looked at those, I saw the prevalence of particular themes. And those themes ran, I would say, they emphasized aspects of the social and cultural history of the Punjab that I was not readily seeing in the history writing that we had, right? So in a way, I'm always struck by learning something new. And when I went to these texts, they emphasized aspects of social life that was not what was being amplified in the scholarly literature that I was reading about late colonial Punjab. So where that scholarly literature emphasized religious identity and religious difference and contention, helping us understand how we get to the partition of India, this literature, which was popular and circulated widely and was published in both Nastaliq and in Gurmukhi, this literature emphasized a different set of themes. And my interpretation of the prevalence of those themes and the remarkable number of texts that were produced and circulated is that those themes had resonance with their readers and listeners. And it's on that basis that I identified three particular themes that I thought were important to our understanding of late colonial Punjabi society. And one of those was gender, where what we see in the representations of Hir, in the representations of other female figures, but particularly in Hir, is a very powerful female figure, literary figure, who defies social expectations, who pursues her own truth. And we see that manifest in this text and in various iterations. And the fact that this was a popular literature allows me to argue that this representation has resonance with its listeners and readers. The second thing I identified was the emphasis on Zat. So a particular kind of social formation over and above religious identity or sectarian identity. something that was beyond the natal family, but clearly defined, right? And so this was a form of social solidarity that was crucially important in Punjabi life in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And the third theme was what I called shared piety, a set of very clear kind of articulations of what it meant to be pious that actually defied religious distinctions of Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh. And the prevalence of these themes in a literature that was rewritten, republished again and again, and yet always these themes emerged, allowed me to argue that these are themes that we should take seriously when we think about late colonial Punjabi society. So when I was embarking on this project, I was concerned. I'm trained as a historian. I have a degree from a department of history. And while I did some formal archival work looking at records of the colonial state, certainly to understand, for example, colonial language policy, which helps kind of frame my history of late colonial Punjab, that was more traditional kind of source material. But I understood rather early that the primary source that was going to be the grounds for my work was going to be popular literature published in the late colonial period. And I undoubtedly at the time had some concerns that historians would not think this a valid primary source. That you can use this to I think at the time there was the sense you can use it to embellish work but not actually be the grounds for analysis. And I have to say I was very pleasantly surprised that I almost never encountered that skepticism that I had anticipated. I think that indeed at the time and that this tendency has only increased with time. Our emphasis on interdisciplinarity has made us much more open to understanding different methodologies and the value of them and crossing disciplinary boundaries. I see my work as sitting in an interdisciplinary space with history and literature and indeed religious studies also. And the methods from these various disciplines I have felt free to employ. Having said that, I would say that the way I treat the literary text is not the same way that a trained literary critic might treat that text. I think I see the work of some of my literary critic colleagues working with South Asian languages. I look at them with great admiration because they are able to do things with the text that I simply am not. So it's not that the methods collapse entirely. We're bringing different kind of our own intellectual formations to the same text, and we will read them slightly differently. So I think that the emphasis increasingly in scholarly circles on interdisciplinarity has allowed an openness to my method. I work hard, however, to provide the context. And I think that that's one thing that's crucially important to the way that a historian will use literary texts as source material. One must understand the context of their production. And as I think I've said in response to another question today, that you provide that context along various axes. One that I endeavor to do is a literary historical axis, so we can try and understand the literature in a sense on its own terms. But then I also try and provide a kind of social and cultural context, which might help us understand how and why the literature was produced, how it may have circulated, how it may have actually been received. And I think that together, kind of trying to map literary texts along both of these axes then allows them to serve as really excellent sources for doing social and cultural history. Yeah, so when I started this research, partly it was the impetus was that the historiography of modern South Asia, the partition of 1947, is a major marker in that historiography, and it really emphasized the rise of religious difference and indeed contention, religious antagonism, right? The rise of communalism in the late 19th century that carries into the early 20th century and kind of leads us to the partition of India. And as I was engaging in my work on Punjabi cultural history and seeing that there were these very clear affective ties through language between people of different religions, one of the contexts that I was hoping to help us think about was this question of religious antagonism and how it has been understood. And in the historiography at the time, it often seemed as though there was a duality, or there were these two poles. And on one end was communalism, with its embedded in ideas of religious antagonism, and at the other end was this idea of syncretism, where things melded into some kind of a context in which people of different religions, a mixing of religions to some kind of harmonious space where there was no antagonism, right? And so in the essay that you've referenced, I was trying to think through this question because undoubtedly there is religious antagonism in certain contexts in our history and indeed in our present, both sectarian and communal. And yet we know that people of different religions participated in what we would put in the realm of religious practice in shared practices. And the question really was, is syncretism helping us understand what is going on in those places? And so in that essay, I tried to lay out a number of arguments about why I think syncretism, in a sense, obfuscates more than it clarifies. And part of that has to do with, one, this idea that syncretism is kind of in opposition to communalism. And so in that sense, they become linked to one another. The other was, as you posed in the question, this point that syncretism assumed this idea of these very discrete religions that then mingle into something new. And in that mingling, part of what I was arguing in that piece is that it's as though one's, and I think I used the language of pre-existing religious identity, somehow gets diminished in the context of that mingling. And yet what I was seeing in its representation from these texts that I was working on is that their representation didn't seem to map well onto our conceptual language. And so I used the language of shared piety because I felt that it did not require any kind of distancing from one's quote unquote preconceived religious identity. That is, people don't become less Hindu, less Muslim, or less Sikh because they go to a Sufi shrine, right? They I think, are entirely clear about what their religious identity is, and yet they're also clear that they're participating in a form of veneration that can be shared by people of different traditions. So I used shared piety as a way to get us out of some of, I thought, the kind of dead ends that the scholarship on syncretism was leading us to in this particular context. Having said that, I do think that moving away that in every context in which it is used, syncretism will have similar kind of baggage. We know what that baggage is in the context of late colonial India, but if you move it to different historical and cultural contexts, there will be similar kinds of baggage that is specific to that context. And so I would hope that thinking about sort of shared piety might be a way to get out of some of those dead ends and understand that people can be very clear in their self-conception of what their religious identity is, but that does not preclude their ability to participate in a form of devotion that that allows people of all communities. So I'll give one example that I saw with my own eyes. Some years ago, I was in Turkey, and I went just outside, I believe, the city of Ephesus, which is this kind of magnificent site from the ancient world. But I went to the Shrine of Mary, and that is a shrine. Mary is a hallowed, revered figure in Islam and in Christianity. And there I saw people from both of those traditions going and participating in the veneration of Mary. And I thought, yeah, this might be another place that we could talk about shared piety, because what these people are doing is not syncretic. They're not merging their tradition with something else. They seemed quite clear in their understanding that they were either Christians or Muslims. They had clarity about their understanding of their veneration for Mary. And yet this is something that as a Muslim you could do, and as a Christian you could do, and yet you were doing, in essence, the same thing. You were venerating Mary. And so maybe that's one example one could give where shared piety might be a helpful analytic for thinking about what's happening there. That might be a challenging question to answer, because it has many parts, but let me try and give a sense of what I am trying to accomplish in the work that I am doing currently. So I am working on Urdu akhlaq literature that was published in the late colonial period. And I am reading this literature to help us understand late colonial social and cultural history, and perhaps even intellectual history in this case. I think that this literature, it was, based on my research, we can see that it was popular. It was produced by commercial presses. There was a market for this literature. And in fact, there's a very clear burgeoning of Urdu akhlaq publications and circulation in the late 19th century. So as a historian, when you see that kind of a burst up, just statistically, you have to ask yourself, why did this happen? And the simple answer to that question is that it's because this literature was doing some kind of work in society, right? These things are not, this is not happenstance. This is a phenomenon that we need to now unpack and understand. And it's in that context that I started looking at akhlaq texts to understand their broad circulation and to try and analyze why these texts were being so heavily, in a sense, patronized, right? Like by literateurs were taking up this genre and publishing in it. Presses were soliciting the creation of these texts because many authors actually write in their introductions about how they came to write the text. And one of the texts I'm working on, it's very clear that actually a rather famous publisher of late 19th century Lahore, Mahbub Alam, solicited the creation of an akhlaq text, which then was called Mahbub al-Akhlaq, in a sense, as a signal, perhaps, to that patron, although it could also translate rather simply as beloved ethics, right? It has that kind of double entendre. But as I started myself interrogating Urdu akhlaq texts, I also was simultaneously looking at how have these texts been written about in South Asian historiography. And so there has been some wonderful work on akhlaq, Urdu akhlaq literature. And one of the things I noted was that that work conceptualized the literature as Islamicate, drawing on Marshall Hodgson's term, which he had created in his study of Islam. He wrote a kind of magnificent book called The Venture of Islam, looking at Islam globally, where he recognized that many of the contributions that came out of Islam and its global expansion were not just religious, but they were cultural. And that people who were non-Muslim participated in that cultural realm. And so he was looking for a language. And so Islamicate has been a really important concept in South Asian, for the understanding of South Asian societies. I actually think it's a very powerful and effective concept for helping us think through some of the things that were happening in the Delhi Sultanates, the Deccan Sultanates, and the Mughal, in post-Mughal successor states. In fact, wonderful work has shown that even in non-Muslim polities, that is, that were not headed by Muslim dynasties, like the Vijayanagara Empire, these too embraced Islamicate cultures. So the analytic itself is actually quite useful. What I'm trying to point out in my work is that when we use that analytic to understand Urdu akhlaq texts, we limit them So when we understand Urdu akhlaq texts as Islamicate, we limit their contributions or we limit our analysis to the realm of culture. And in a way, we evacuate what may be the religious content of those texts. And in my reading, those texts actually have a religious context. And that context is that they are drawing on a millennia-old tradition of Islamic philosophical ethics, which is a particular branch of Islamic philosophy. And they are very self-consciously placing themselves within this genealogy of a genre of Islamic philosophical ethics. And so by suggesting that we understand these texts as Islamic, I'm trying to bring our understanding of this genre, right, to a place where we can understand that a text can be Islamic, right? And in a way, we certainly understand some genres as Islamic. It's not even a question. And we understand some genres of intellectual production as Islamic. So tafsir, that's Islamic. Nobody questions that. But it's a literary genre where things begin to get a little hazier. And so when we identify akhlaq as Islamicate, we can very clearly see the culture work it did, and it did this for both Hindus and Muslims. But it obfuscates the ways in which this literature, I believe, was also contributing to the production of Muslim subjectivities, modern Muslim subjectivities in the late colonial period. So to clarify, it's not a rejection of the category Islamicate, it's about its application to this particular genre of Urdu texts. And the implications of this, I think, are not only for our understanding of this Urdu genre, but then also for our understanding of Urdu literary history, where we have certain traditions or a certain aspect of Urdu literary history emphasizes the shared nature of the Urdu tradition, shared between people of different religious communities, and then simultaneously recognizes the importance of Urdu in the cultivation of Muslim subjectivity and identity, but we very rarely are able to see these two things at the same time. And I think akhlaq affords an opportunity to think about an Urdu genre that was both shared and Islamic, and tries to tease out, how do we as scholars of Urdu literature, as scholars of South Asian history, how do we contend with what seems like, from our contemporary perspective, a contradiction, because things are either shared or they're Islamic. But I'm arguing that akhlaq is both shared, right, and Islamic, and hence my desire to move away from an understanding of akhlaq as Islamic hate, but rather an insistence that it is Islamic. So the advice I would offer to any kind of aspiring academic is to work on something that you feel passionate about in some register. Because what we engage in the scholarly endeavor is really a lifelong process of learning. And I think that it's more pleasurable if it is linked to something that you feel passionate about. That passion could be a political passion. It could be a passion around, particular intellectual questions. It can be a aesthetic passion. But I would really just encourage you to work on something that you're passionate about. That is, that you care about it. For me, there is a quite direct connection between the work that I do and the things that I deeply care about. And even though I think sometimes for the uninitiated, it may be a little bit hard to see that connection, I can draw one out as an example today, which is that I see my current work on Urdu akhlaq literature as an attempt to contribute to what is already a very rich body of scholarship on the history of Islam in late colonial India or colonial India. And the contribution that I hope it will make is to actually diversify our understanding of Muslim life worlds in the late colonial period, that it will be in addition to our current understanding. And my commitment to that desire to diversify our understanding, to understand the complexity and the multiplicity of Muslim life worlds. So, we have wonderful scholarship about Reformed Islam. We have wonderful scholarship about Sufism. We have much less scholarship on the impact of the Islamic philosophical tradition, particularly among lay Muslims, as it were. And I hope that my work can contribute to that. But the contribution, and the thing that makes me passionate about wanting to make that contribution, is because we live in a world in which the understanding of Islam can so often be so diminished. And so to want to bring more diversity, to expand our understanding, is really important to me.